The moment you believe you've caught the person you love betraying you, your heart stops asking for proof and starts preparing to break. Charlotte Bennett never imagined that a single ordinary Thursday afternoon would become the day every memory of her marriage began unraveling. The city skyline shimmered beneath a pale autumn sun as she stepped out of the rideshare in downtown Chicago, clutching a small white bakery box that held Ethan's favorite bourbon pecan pie. Their second wedding anniversary was only 2 days away, but he had been buried in meetings for weeks, barely making it home before midnight. She thought surprising him with lunch might remind both of them of the couple they used to be before conference calls, private jets, and endless board meetings filled every corner of their lives. She smiled as she crossed the polished marble lobby of Walker Global headquarters, greeting familiar security officers who had known her since the wedding. Ethan always insisted she never needed an appointment. This building, he often joked, belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. Yet today, something felt strangely different. His assistant, Melissa, stood the moment Charlotte stepped off the elevator, her usually confident smile replaced by a nervous hesitation. Mr. Walker had to leave unexpectedly, she explained, avoiding eye contact. He canceled the rest of his afternoon. Charlotte frowned. Ethan had texted only 30 minutes earlier saying he would be in meetings until evening. Did something happen? She asked gently. Melissa forced a smile that looked rehearsed. I'm sure he'll explain when he gets home. Explain what? The question lingered in Charlotte's mind as she thanked her and returned to the elevator. Outside, the crisp breeze carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. She had almost reached the sidewalk when a familiar black Mercedes SUV rolled past the entrance. Ethan sat inside. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't speaking with clients. Instead, he was smiling. It was the relaxed, genuine smile Charlotte hadn't seen in months. Curiosity pulled her forward before reason could stop her. She hailed another rideshare and quietly asked the driver to follow the SUV, apologizing for how strange the request sounded. 20 minutes later they arrived at a private rooftop helipad overlooking Lake Michigan. Charlotte remained inside the car, watching through the tinted window as Ethan stepped out. Moments later, a woman with chestnut hair approached him. She looked elegant, perhaps in her early 30s, carrying a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. Ethan reached for her hands. They exchanged a few quiet words Charlotte couldn't hear. Then, before she could convince herself there had to be another explanation, the woman leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. Ethan embraced her just as warmly. Charlotte felt every sound around her disappear. The helicopters, the traffic below, even the beating of her own heart seemed swallowed by a silence so heavy it stole the air from her lungs. Her fingers tightened around the bakery box until the cardboard bent beneath her grip. The pie she had carefully chosen for the man she loved suddenly felt painfully ridiculous. She stared at the two figures standing together beneath the endless blue sky, and for the first time since saying I do, Charlotte Bennett wondered if her millionaire husband had been living a life she was never meant to see. Charlotte did not remember how the rideshare carried her home that afternoon. The streets of Chicago blurred past the window like scenes from someone else's life while one image replayed over and over inside her mind. Ethan smiling. Ethan reaching for another woman's hands. Ethan returning an embrace that looked effortless, familiar, comfortable. She unlocked the front door of their penthouse just before sunset. Everything inside looked exactly the way it always had. The fresh lilies she had arranged 3 days earlier still stood on the dining table. Ethan's navy blazer rested neatly across the back of a chair. A jazz playlist drifted softly through the built-in speakers because she had forgotten to turn it off before leaving that morning. Nothing had changed. Yet somehow everything had. Charlotte carefully placed the crushed bakery box on the kitchen counter. When she opened it, the pie had shifted to one side, its carefully woven crust broken beyond repair. She stared at it for several long seconds before quietly closing the lid again. Somehow, it felt like the perfect reflection of her own heart. Her eyes wandered through the apartment until they settled on a framed photograph from 2 years earlier. It had been taken outside a small chapel overlooking Lake Geneva in Wisconsin. There had been no celebrity guests, no extravagant ballroom, no television cameras. Ethan had insisted on something simple. Just close family, a few lifelong friends, and promises that sounded too sincere to belong in the world of billion-dollar companies. She remembered the first time they met almost as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Charlotte had been struggling to keep her late father's neighborhood animal clinic alive. Bills stacked higher every month. The roof leaked every spring. Medical equipment constantly needed repairs she could barely afford. Ethan had walked into the clinic carrying an injured golden retriever that had been struck by a bicycle courier. He never mentioned who he was. To Charlotte, he was simply a polite man who spent more time comforting the frightened dog than worrying about the cost of treatment. She only discovered days later that the quiet stranger owned one of the largest technology companies in America. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on ordinary dinners, Sunday walks along the lakefront, and conversations that lasted long after midnight. Ethan listened more than he spoke. He remembered every little detail she shared, from her favorite childhood books to the exact way she liked hot chocolate on snowy mornings. Even after they married, despite the wealth surrounding him, he never treated love like another business transaction. At least, that was what Charlotte had always believed. Somewhere during the past 3 months, little things began changing. Business trips became more frequent. Late-night conference calls stretched past midnight. Messages arrived that made Ethan quietly step onto the balcony before answering. Whenever Charlotte asked if everything was all right, he would smile, kiss her forehead, and say, "Just a few surprises I cannot tell you about yet." She had wanted to believe him. Love often meant trusting what you could not see. But now every forgotten dinner, every cancelled weekend, every mysterious phone call seemed to rearrange themselves into a story she no longer recognized. As darkness settled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Charlotte heard the familiar sound of the front door unlocking. Ethan walked inside carrying his briefcase, his expression warm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "Hey," he said with the same gentle smile that had once made her feel safe. "I missed you today." Charlotte forced herself to smile back, hiding the storm building inside her. Then she noticed something she had never seen before. Resting on the sleeve of Ethan's charcoal jacket was a single strand of long chestnut-colored hair. Charlotte wanted to ask about the strand of hair the moment she saw it, but the words refused to leave her lips. Instead, she reached for his jacket with a smile she barely recognized as her own. "You look exhausted," she said softly. "Let me hang this up." Ethan thanked her without hesitation and disappeared toward the bedroom to change for dinner. The instant he closed the door, Charlotte stared at the long chestnut hair resting against the dark fabric. It was impossible to ignore. Her own hair was blonde, several shades lighter. She carefully lifted the strand between her fingers before dropping it into the trash, immediately feeling guilty for even noticing it. Maybe it belonged to someone in the office. Maybe it had blown onto his jacket in an elevator. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Ethan returned a few minutes later wearing a gray sweater and his usual relaxed smile. During dinner he asked about her day, laughed at a story about one of the rescued puppies from the clinic, and even apologized for working so much lately. "I know I have been distracted," he admitted. "After this week, everything will finally make sense." Charlotte looked into his eyes, searching for the honesty she had trusted for 2 years. She wanted to believe him. She almost did. Then his phone lit up on the table. The screen flashed only a first initial. V. Ethan glanced at it, quietly turned the phone face down, and excused himself. "I have to take this. It will only be a minute." He stepped onto the balcony and closed the sliding glass door behind him. Charlotte could not hear every word through the thick glass, but she caught enough to make her chest tighten. Yes, tomorrow morning works. No, she cannot know yet, everything has to stay exactly as planned. He returned less than 5 minutes later wearing the same calm expression. "Just work," he said before she even asked. "One more headache before the anniversary?" Charlotte nodded. She hated how quickly the explanation arrived, almost as though he had prepared it in advance. The next morning Ethan left before sunrise. His side of the bed was already cold when Charlotte reached across the sheets. She made coffee, fed the elderly rescue cat they had adopted together, and tried to lose herself in paperwork at the clinic. Instead, every few minutes her thoughts drifted back to the rooftop, the embrace, the mysterious phone call, and the chestnut hair. Around noon, her longtime friend Rachel stopped by with supplies for the clinic. One look at Charlotte's face was enough. "Something is wrong," Rachel said quietly. Charlotte hesitated before finally telling her everything except the part about following Ethan. Rachel listened without interrupting, then sighed. "You know Ethan better than anyone. Have you asked him directly?" Charlotte looked down at the examination table where an old Labrador was sleeping peacefully after surgery. "I am afraid of the answer," she whispered. Rachel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Or maybe you are afraid of what your imagination is doing without the answer." Those words stayed with Charlotte all afternoon. She wanted to dismiss every suspicion as insecurity. She wanted to remember the man who spent rainy Sundays building doghouses for abandoned animals simply because it made children smile. But later that evening, while organizing receipts for the clinic, she noticed an email notification appear on the shared family tablet Ethan sometimes used. The message contained only one sentence. "Reservation confirmed for 2 guests at the Grand Crescent Hotel, Friday, 7 o'clock. Friday was their wedding anniversary. Friday arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel, and every hour felt heavier than the one before it. Charlotte tried to keep herself busy at the clinic, but her hands moved on instinct while her thoughts stayed fixed on one place across the city. The Grand Crescent Hotel. By late afternoon she had convinced herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Ethan was organizing an anniversary dinner. Perhaps the reservation for 2 included a business client before meeting her later. Hope, she realized, had an incredible talent for inventing excuses. At 6:15 she left the clinic, her heart pounding harder with every block she drove toward downtown. She parked across the street from the hotel and remained inside her car for several minutes, watching guests disappear through the revolving doors beneath sparkling chandeliers. At exactly 6:55, Ethan's familiar black Mercedes pulled to the curb. Charlotte held her breath. Ethan stepped out wearing the charcoal suit she had bought him for his birthday. He looked around briefly before walking inside with quiet confidence. A few moments later another car arrived. The same woman Charlotte had seen at the helipad climbed out carrying the same leather portfolio. Her chestnut hair rested neatly over one shoulder. She smiled as soon as she spotted Ethan waiting near the entrance. He returned the smile immediately. Charlotte could not hear their conversation from where she stood, but she watched Ethan gently place a hand against the woman's back as they entered the hotel together. It was such a natural gesture that it pierced deeper than any accusation ever could. Fighting tears, Charlotte quietly followed them into the elegant lobby. Crystal lights reflected across polished marble floors while a pianist played soft jazz in the corner. She kept enough distance to avoid being noticed as Ethan and the woman entered a private dining room reserved for special events. Through the partially opened doors Charlotte caught only brief glimpses between passing servers. A beautifully decorated table stood near the windows. Fresh white roses covered the room. Candles flickered across the linen tablecloth. It looked less like a business meeting and more like a celebration. Her breathing became shallow. Then a hotel employee wheeled in a velvet presentation case and carefully placed it on the table. Ethan opened the case. Even from across the room Charlotte recognized the unmistakable sparkle of a diamond ring. The woman looked at it, smiled warmly, and nodded as Ethan said something she could not hear. Charlotte stepped backward before either of them could see her. every piece of hope she had clung to during the past several days collapsed at once. She hurried outside, the cool evening air doing nothing to steady her trembling hands. Sitting alone inside her car, she stared through the windshield as the lights of the hotel blurred behind tears she could no longer hold back. The anniversary she had treasured for weeks suddenly felt like a cruel countdown to heartbreak. By the time she reached home, Ethan had not yet returned. The penthouse felt impossibly quiet. Charlotte walked slowly into the study and opened the small fireproof safe where they kept important family documents. Her fingers paused over their marriage certificate before settling on a folder of legal papers. Tucked behind financial records was a blank copy of a divorce agreement that had remained there since their wedding, prepared by attorneys but never signed because Ethan had laughed one day and said they would never need it. Charlotte placed the document on the desk and stared at the empty signature line. For the first time since becoming Mrs. Charlotte Walker, she picked up a pen. Charlotte lowered the pen before the ink could touch the paper. Her hand trembled so badly that she could not even write the first letter of her name. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways over the past few hours, believing anger would make the decision easier. Instead, all she felt was grief. She loved Ethan. That was the cruelest part of all. If she had stopped loving him, walking away would have been simple. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the penthouse, and Charlotte quickly slipped the unsigned papers back into the folder before Ethan entered the study. He loosened his tie and smiled the moment he saw her. "I was hoping you would still be awake," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be a really important day." Charlotte searched his face, looking for even the smallest trace of guilt. She found only excitement, almost like a man counting down the hours until something wonderful happened. The contrast made her heart ache even more. "You seem happy," she replied quietly. Ethan walked over and gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "I am. I have been waiting a long time for tomorrow." Every word felt like another piece of evidence against him. She wanted to ask where he had spent the evening. She wanted to ask who the woman was. She wanted to ask why there had been a diamond ring on the table at the hotel. Instead, she simply nodded. "I hope everything goes the way you planned." Ethan smiled. "I think it finally will." The next morning he left before dawn once again, kissing her forehead before quietly closing the apartment door. Charlotte remained standing in the hallway long after the elevator carried him away. By mid-morning she could no longer sit still. She called Richard Coleman, the family attorney who had handled their wedding documents years earlier. Richard answered with his usual calm professionalism, but his voice softened the moment he heard hers. "Charlotte, is everything all right?" She hesitated before asking if the old divorce papers were still legally valid. A long silence followed. "They can be updated if necessary," Richard answered carefully. "But before we discuss paperwork, may I ask whether Ethan knows you are calling?" "No." Richard sighed gently. "Then perhaps he should be the first person you speak with." Charlotte thanked him and ended the call, but the conversation left her feeling even more alone. Around noon her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. It contained only 6 words. "Please trust me until tonight. Love, Ethan." She stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Trust. That single word felt almost impossible now. She slipped the phone into her purse without replying. Late that afternoon another notification appeared. Ethan's location briefly synchronized with their shared family calendar before disappearing again. It showed him on the north side of the city at an unfamiliar property outside Lincoln Park. Charlotte remembered Rachel's words about imagination creating stories where answers were missing. This time she decided she needed the truth instead of assumptions. She drove toward the address with her heartbeat growing louder every mile. When she arrived, she found an old brick building surrounded by construction fencing. Fresh landscaping filled the front entrance. Workers carried boxes through newly painted doors while large white fabric covered an enormous sign near the sidewalk, hiding whatever name had been placed beneath it. Charlotte parked across the street just as Ethan stepped out of his car. Moments later, the same chestnut-haired woman joined him carrying rolled architectural blueprints. Ethan accepted the plans with a grateful smile, and together they walked toward the covered sign. Charlotte tightened her grip on the steering wheel, convinced she was about to witness the final proof that would end her marriage forever. Charlotte watched from across the street, barely remembering to breathe. A handful of construction workers gathered near the entrance while the chestnut-haired woman handed Ethan a folder filled with final documents. They exchanged relieved smiles, not the secretive smiles Charlotte had convinced herself belonged to two people hiding an affair, but the exhausted expressions of people who had finally completed something that had taken months of work. Ethan glanced at his watch, looked toward the covered sign, and nodded. One of the workers pulled the white fabric away in one smooth motion. Charlotte's heart stopped. Large bronze letters shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight. Bennett Family Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation Center. For several endless seconds she simply stared. Bennett. Her father's last name. Her family's name. The clinic her father had struggled to keep alive had always been his greatest dream, but after his passing there had never been enough money to expand beyond the aging neighborhood building. Charlotte had spent years believing that dream had quietly died with him. Yet now an entire modern campus stood before her carrying the very name she had known since childhood. Without realizing it, she stepped out of the car and slowly crossed the street. Ethan had his back turned, speaking with the woman over a large architectural rendering. Charlotte stopped only a few feet away as the woman smiled warmly and said, "The rehabilitation wing is exactly the way your wife described it in her father's old notebook. She is going to love it." Ethan laughed softly, a sound filled with relief instead of secrecy. She deserves to see her father's dream finally become real. Charlotte felt the ground beneath her shift. The woman turned and noticed her first. "Mr. Walker," she said gently. "I think your surprise just arrived a little earlier than expected." Ethan spun around. The excitement on his face instantly changed to confusion. "Charlotte," he asked. "What are you doing here?" She looked from him to the building and back again, unable to speak. Ethan slowly walked toward her, concern replacing his smile. "Are you all right?" Finally, the words escaped in little more than a whisper. Who is she?" Ethan looked genuinely surprised before glancing toward the woman. "Charlotte, this is Victoria Reynolds. She is the lead architect who has spent the last 8 months helping me build this place." Victoria extended her hand with a kind smile. "It is so nice to finally meet you. I feel like I already know you after hearing so many stories from your husband." Charlotte stared at the offered hand before slowly shaking it. Ethan looked at her carefully, as though pieces of an invisible puzzle were suddenly falling into place. His eyes drifted toward her tear-filled expression, then toward the building, and finally back to her again. "You thought..." He began quietly before stopping himself. Charlotte lowered her head, ashamed of everything she had believed. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed a small velvet box. It was the very same one she had seen at the hotel. He opened it, revealing not one ring for another woman, but a beautifully crafted wedding band engraved with tiny paw prints along the inside. "The dinner at the hotel was never a date," he said softly. "Victoria was helping me choose the final design because I wanted to ask you to marry me again today. Not because we needed another wedding, but because I wanted to replace every promise I made 2 years ago with better ones." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears as every suspicious moment she had collected over the past weeks suddenly rearranged itself into an entirely different story. Charlotte could no longer hold back the tears. They slipped silently down her cheeks as she looked from the engraved wedding band to the bronze letters across the front of the building. Every painful conclusion she had reached during the past week now felt unbearably heavy. Ethan closed the velvet box without another word. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes carried not confusion but quiet hurt. "Why did you not ask me?" he said gently. There was no anger in his voice, only sadness. Charlotte lowered her gaze. Because every answer seemed obvious, she whispered. I saw you with Victoria. I saw the hotel. I saw the ring. I heard the phone calls. Every piece fit together. Ethan nodded slowly. Just not the right picture. The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Charlotte covered her face with trembling hands. I even called Richard. Ethan looked surprised. Richard Coleman? She nodded. I asked him about the divorce papers. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment before letting out a slow breath. So we came that close. Charlotte could barely speak. I almost signed them. Silence settled between them while workers quietly continued planting flowers near the entrance, respectfully pretending not to notice the emotional conversation unfolding only a few yards away. Victoria discreetly excused herself, gathering the blueprints and walking toward the opposite side of the property to give them privacy. Ethan looked back at the building. 8 months, he said softly. That is how long we have been working on this. He smiled faintly, though the sadness remained in his eyes. I found one of your father's journals in the attic last winter. Every page was filled with sketches for a larger rescue center. Physical therapy pools. Adoption classrooms. Veterinary training labs. He even drew benches where families could sit with rescued dogs before bringing them home. Charlotte remembered the notebook immediately. Her father had carried it everywhere during the final years of his life. She had never realized Ethan had discovered it. I wanted to finish his dream before showing it to you, Ethan continued. Not because I wanted to hide anything from you. Because I wanted you to experience one day without worrying about budgets, broken roofs, or fundraising dinners. I wanted your father to keep his promise through me. Charlotte looked around the beautiful campus again. Every detail suddenly became familiar. The brick pathways matched sketches she had seen years earlier. The blue entrance doors were exactly the shade her mother once loved. Even the small memorial garden beside the building had white benches identical to those her father had drawn in faded pencil. Ethan had not built his own vision. He had rebuilt her family's. Charlotte stepped closer until only a few inches separated them. I am so sorry, she whispered through tears. I stopped trusting the man who has never given me a reason to doubt his heart. Ethan gently reached for her hands. You had reasons, he replied quietly. I created them. I thought protecting the surprise was more important than explaining why I kept disappearing. I never imagined the silence would hurt you more than the truth. Charlotte looked into his eyes and finally saw the exhaustion she had mistaken for distance during the past several months. It had never been another woman. It had been late nights reviewing construction plans, meeting contractors, selling personal investments, and quietly carrying the weight of a dream he wanted to place in her hands. She realized then that love could survive misunderstandings, but only if both people were brave enough to replace assumptions with honest conversations before fear wrote the ending for them. The official opening ceremony took place 3 weeks later beneath a clear blue September sky. Neighbors, veterinarians, volunteers, and local business owners filled the courtyard outside the new rescue center. Families wandered through the landscaped gardens while dozens of rescued dogs happily greeted visitors with wagging tails and hopeful eyes. Laughter drifted through the crisp afternoon air, blending with the gentle music of a small string quartet. Charlotte stood just inside the entrance, taking in every detail she had once believed could exist only in her father's imagination. The rehabilitation pool reflected sunlight through wide glass windows. The adoption rooms felt warm instead of clinical. Children's drawings of rescued animals decorated one hallway, donated by local schools to celebrate the grand opening. Even the memorial garden carried a bronze plaque engraved with her parents' names and a simple sentence that made her heart swell with emotion. Every animal deserves a second chance because every life matters. Ethan quietly joined her, dressed in a navy suit, watching visitors smile as they explored the building. Your father would have loved seeing this place full of people, he said softly. Charlotte slipped her hand into his. He would have thanked you himself. Ethan shook his head with a gentle smile. No. He would have reminded me that this was always your family's dream. I only helped finish the construction. Before Charlotte could answer, the master of ceremonies invited everyone to gather near the stage outside. Applause echoed across the courtyard as community leaders thanked donors and volunteers. Charlotte assumed Ethan would deliver the keynote speech. Instead, he quietly stepped away from the podium after a brief introduction. There is only one person who should tell this story, he said into the microphone. Charlotte, would you come up here? She looked at him in surprise before slowly walking onto the stage. Hundreds of familiar and unfamiliar faces turned toward her. For a moment she forgot every prepared sentence. Then she noticed Ethan standing quietly below the stage, looking at her with the same patient kindness he had shown the frightened golden retriever the day they first met. Charlotte reached into her purse and unfolded a worn piece of paper she had carried for years. It was a letter she had written to her father shortly after his passing but had never found the courage to read aloud. Her voice trembled as she began. Dad, I always believed I failed you because I could not save your dream. I thought the little clinic was all I had left to protect. Today I finally understand that dreams do not disappear when one person cannot carry them alone. Sometimes they quietly wait for another heart willing to help lift the weight. Many in the audience wiped away tears as she continued reading. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and looked directly at Ethan. A few days ago, she said honestly, I almost allowed fear to destroy the greatest blessing of my life because I trusted my assumptions more than the man standing in front of me. Love deserves better than silence. It deserves conversations, patience, and the courage to ask difficult questions before believing painful answers. The courtyard became completely still. Ethan slowly walked toward the stage, his expression filled with quiet emotion. Charlotte stepped down to meet him halfway. Without a single word, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tighter than ever before. The applause that followed was not for a millionaire, a beautiful building, or an extraordinary donation. It was for two people who had found their way back to each other by choosing truth over fear and understanding over pride. 6 months passed, and the Bennett Family Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation Center became one of the most respected nonprofit facilities in Illinois. Every morning the parking lot filled with volunteers before sunrise. Families arrived hoping to adopt a new companion. Veterinary students completed internships in the bright training wing Ethan had insisted on building. The little neighborhood clinic Charlotte had fought so hard to save remained open as an outreach branch, while the new center gave hundreds of abandoned animals the second chance her father had always imagined. Charlotte often walked through the gardens just before opening each day, pausing beside the memorial plaque that honored her parents. Instead of feeling the ache of unfinished dreams, she now felt quiet gratitude. Their story had not ended. It had simply continued through different hands. Ethan kept his promise as well. No more mysterious meetings. No more unexplained late nights without conversation. Whenever work demanded extra hours, he told Charlotte exactly where he would be and why. Charlotte made a promise of her own. She would never allow fear to write a story before asking the person she loved to tell the truth first. One cool October evening, after the last visitors had gone home, the center grew peaceful again. Golden leaves drifted across the walking paths while rescued dogs settled into their beds for the night. Ethan asked Charlotte to meet him in the memorial garden. She smiled the moment she arrived because tiny white lights now glowed among the trees, transforming the familiar space into something almost magical. At the center of the garden stood the same wooden bench her father had once sketched inside his notebook years before. Ethan waited beside it, wearing the same navy suit he had worn on the day of the grand opening. In his hands rested the small velvet box that had nearly become the symbol of heartbreak but had instead become the symbol of truth. He smiled as Charlotte approached. 2 years ago, he began softly, I asked you to marry me because I knew I wanted to spend my life with you. Today I understand something even more important. A marriage is not built by perfect surprises or perfect plans. It is built every day by choosing each other again, especially after misunderstandings. He opened the velvet box, revealing the engraved wedding band with the tiny paw prints sparkling beneath the garden lights. Charlotte Bennett Walker, will you marry me again, not to begin a new life, but to celebrate the one we almost forgot how to protect? Tears filled Charlotte's eyes as she laughed through a smile. Yes, she whispered before repeating it with complete certainty. Yes, I will. Ethan gently placed the new ring beside her original wedding band, not replacing the old promise but adding to it. They embraced beneath the quiet autumn sky while friends, family, volunteers, and even Victoria stepped from behind the trees, applauding with joyful smiles. No lavish ballroom could have felt more meaningful than that simple garden filled with people who truly cared about them. Later that evening, Charlotte carefully placed the crushed white bakery box from months earlier inside a memory cabinet at the center, next to her father's notebook and the first adoption certificate issued by the new facility. She kept it there as a reminder that even broken moments could become part of a beautiful ending when love chose honesty over fear. Whenever visitors asked about the display, Charlotte simply smiled and said, "The strongest relationships are not the ones that never face doubt. They are the ones where truth arrives before love gives up." And every time she looked at Ethan across the courtyard, surrounded by wagging tails, grateful families, and the dream they had built together, she realized that the day she believed she had lost everything had quietly become the day she learned that real love is proven not by perfect appearances, but by faithful actions, patient hearts, and the courage to trust again.